Last week, my girlfriend broke up with me. But we don't care about that! We care about the sick-ass game I made for Ludum Dare 56 in 48 hours about a carnivorous corpse aquarium. So the theme dropped at 6 p.m. and it was tiny creatures. The first part of any game jam is coming up with the idea. This is very important because if you have a bad idea, no matter what you do, your game is going to be bad. It can take a lot of time to come up with a good idea, but it's worth it. This time I got lucky. I had recently set up my first aquarium, so I knew I wanted to make the game aquarium themed. Aquariums can have tiny creatures in them. I decided to make the game about managing an aquarium because I feel like games where you just buy upgrades and watch your units do all the work for you are so satisfying. Given it's spooky season, I wanted to make the game dark. My idea was to make a game about disposing of bodies for a criminal organization using an aquarium. It's a pretty goofy idea, but that's the beauty of game jams. People are free to make goofy games without worrying if they're too goofy for the market. Now that I had my idea, I started to flesh out the details. The style, gameplay loop, lore and backstory. I feel that it's really important to design your game on paper because it forces you to design your game thoroughly. If you don't, you're more liable to switch ideas mid-jam, which can lead to work being scrapped. Last design thing I did was outline the MVP, the minimum viable product. These are the minimum features required for your complete game. When doing a jam, you should aim to complete these features first and then the extra things after. It was time to start on the game. I started with some art first. The first thing I made was the aquarium. It looks kind of bad at this stage. Next I drew a snail, taking inspiration from my real life aquarium, which only has snails in it for now. The art isn't amazing, but it's a game jam. It doesn't need to be great. It just needs to get the point across. Don't let bad art skills stop you from doing a jam. Then I drew a fish. After that, I started on the corpse sprite. I took inspiration from Jason Voorhees from the Friday the 13th movies and drew him chained to a rock. I created a Godot project, imported all my art, and started working on the actual game. The first thing I worked on was a creature, the snail. Snails don't swim, they slither on the floor, so their pathing needs to be a bit more complicated. I used a Navigation Agent 2D and Navigation Region 2D node to achieve the pathing I wanted, where snails could slither up the legs of bodies to access them. I wrote the code that spawns the snails on a random point on the floor, and then the code for snail idling, where the snail picks a random point on the floor and paths to it every time a timer node goes off. This is what the first version of the idling snail looks like. I made him slightly smaller and made his sprite point in the direction he's moving in. I drew a texture for the UI components, but it didn't look good, so I didn't use it in the final game. I also resized the aquarium background image because I realized I needed more space for the UI. Then I built a basic by creature menu. I used a signal to have the UI node tell the main game node to spawn snails when the button is pressed. I drew the first version of the spokesman icon. This is the person that gives the player the corpse disposal contracts. Next I drew an icon for the corpses. Originally I wanted many different corpse variants, but I figured I didn't have time for that. At this point I left to get beer because I was kind of depressed. I had so much trouble building a contract menu using the Godot UI container nodes. Eventually I gave up and just placed everything manually. Then I decided to revamp the aquarium background image because I felt like it was way too flat. I also added ceiling lights to the background because I wanted to add moody lighting to the game. When it came to actually implementing the light, I struggled a lot. Using a point light with a gradient texture didn't produce the effect that I wanted, because I wanted clean lines separating the light from each lamp. One of the things I tried to do was add light occluders in between the spaces of the lamps. My thinking was I could add the light above the game area, have it shine down through the gaps between the light occluders and look like the light is coming from the lamps. Long story short, this doesn't make any sense. Point lights don't actually shoot light rays. You're essentially just overlaying a light texture on the screen. Another thing I tried was having triangular shaped light occluders. This produced weird, ugly shadows. I added a semi-transparent color rec to the game to stand in for the water. It ended up looking really good. It came back to the light with a simpler strategy. I drew a texture to represent the cone of light in the way that I wanted, and added that as the light texture. It worked well. I gave the UI a dark green and brown color scheme. I felt like this fit the grimy vibe I was going for. I wrote code that generates different contracts with different names, weights, and rewards, and also opens the contract menu with new contracts periodically. Then I wrote the code that emits a signal when the spawn corpse button is pressed. Then I animated the corpse decomposition. I used separate layers for the skeleton, skin, and rock and chain. The skeleton layer was the bottom layer and it was the same for every frame. For each frame of the decomposition, I added red to indicate decomposed skin, and also erased more and more pixels to show the skeleton. I added that to the game, then wrote the corpse spawning code. I also made the snail's path towards corpses if one is available. I added an area 2D to the corpse scene so that it can detect the creatures that are meant to be eating it. Each tick, each creature's bite reduces the corpse's weight. The corpse will also be set to the correct frame to represent that stage of decomposition. I needed a break. It was time to make some music. I used this cool website called onlinesequencer.com for the music for all my game jams. There was one instrument sound, Koto, that really inspired me to make a sick beat. This is the final result. After adding the music to the game, I created a label to show the time until the next contract appears, and also a label to show the player's money. Because it's a game jam, sometimes I'm rushing when I'm writing my code and I don't think things through. Usually this is fine because it's fast, but sometimes it creates problems. So I had to go back and refactor some bad code that was causing problems when corpses were deleted. The next day, the first change I made was make it so that every time the contract menu appears, 3 contracts appear instead of 1, and the player can select up to all 3 of them. I wanted the player to be able to fill up their tank with bodies, but having the contract menu appear every 10 seconds would be super annoying. I made a separate script and scene for the fish creature. In retrospect, I should have just extended the existing ones and changed the sprite and behavior depending on if the player wants to spawn a fish or snail. I fixed a slight bug where the game wasn't registering if a corpse was eaten, and at this point the game was looking pretty good. So fish and snails would both eat corpses if they spawned in, and if they were done to eat, they would immediately start idling. After that, I animated the spokesman icon because I wanted him to talk. For some bizarre reason, you can't animate a text direct UI node in Godot, so I replaced it with a sprite 2D node. I wanted to make some sound effects for the game. My workflow for sound effects is I go to the site called jsfxr.com. I just hit random until I make sounds that I like. I wanted to make a talking sound for the spokesman. I realized I could achieve this by selecting Acquire Sound on onlinesequencer.com and then hitting weird rhythms on the same note. I really like the end result. After that, I made it so the player can't accept any more contracts if the aquarium already has 4 bodies. A giant X appears and the spokesman says something unique. I also added a close button to the contract menu. At this point, I took a super long break because I was kind of burnt out. I eventually came back and got back to work. I added all the sound effects I made to the game. One of the sounds I made really sounds like something splashing into water. I used it for the corpse spawn sound. Since the menu hides the aquarium, the player can really imagine the corpse splashing into the water. I was running out of time and my MVP still wasn't done. My original intention was to make a pretty realistic aquarium simulator game where the player had to manage pH, temperature, buy equipment upgrades, and special chemicals if any of the variables go out of whack. I realized I didn't have time for that, so I thought of a simplified biomass capacity mechanic. I added percent bars to indicate the biomass capacity usage and also the aquarium health. The biomass capacity bar seemed to be working, but the percent label wasn't going over 100 when it was supposed to. I realized this was an issue with the Godot version I was using, so I upgraded and that fixed things. So the player has to manage the biomass capacity and ensure they stay under, but the point of the aquarium health bar is so that if they go slightly over, they can still correct themselves without dying immediately. I also banged out an endgame screen where the spokesman displays a custom message based on how many corpses you disposed of. I was feeling the pressure now. The last thing I wanted to add was a plant menu so you could increase your biomass capacity by buying plants. So I speed drew a plant texture. This is what it looks like. I think it looks pretty good. I implemented the functionality of the buy plant button and also made plants increase the total biomass capacity. After that, I fixed some final bugs, which are honestly too boring to talk about. I felt like the MVP was done, so at this point I spent a lot of time tweaking, which is really important because even if your game is technically complete, but the numbers aren't quite right, the game won't be fun to play. It'll be too boring or too hard. For example, I wanted the weight eaten by each creature's bite to be low enough so that the player was incentivized to buy lots of creatures. I also set the starting biomass capacity low so that the player had to buy more plants in order to progress towards being able to put 4 corpses in the tank at once. I barely had enough time to add a button so that the player could end the game and see the spokesman's reaction without waiting for their tank to die. The final change I made was make the aquarium water start to turn green if the aquarium health goes below 100. By then, it was 6 o'clock on the final day, Sunday. I built the game and submitted it. My game was done, and honestly, I was proud of the result. Even though I wasn't able to implement everything I originally wanted to, I simplified things on the fly and delivered a complete game. If you want to play my game, the link will be in the description. I hope the video was entertaining and maybe you even learned a few tips and tricks about doing game jams.